Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, March 18th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about President Biden and President Trump faced up against each other in this upcoming election and how a minimal polling error would be required in order for President Biden to win the 2024 presidential election. Now, on your screen right now is a website that I love to use to track polls, racetothewhitehouse.com. Spelled out exactly like this, .com, and you can find here that they actually take a look at all of the polls that have been taken over the past couple of weeks and have been averaging them over a substantive period of time, all the way back to July of 2023. And what we see here is that looking at, July of 2022, what we look at here is the polling numbers on the national show us a story that President Trump is on track to win re-election this coming November. But it's interesting to see that the leads here in some of these key and crucial battleground states actually isn't as strong as you might think, and that a polling error similar to what we saw for Democrats back in the 2022 midterm elections is a requirement here for President Biden to win the election, and it doesn't seem too far off from reality. Taking a look at President Trump's leads in these battleground states, he has a strong one in states like North Carolina and Florida, states that Donald Trump won in the last election, states like Texas and Iowa and Ohio. And we've seen an increase in support in states like Georgia, where he now leads President Biden by roughly 5 percentage points across the state. His leads have also increased in states like Arizona and Nevada, where the leads are roughly 4 to 5 points depending on the state you're looking at. But just a 2.5% shift, a shift that is well within the margin of error of almost all of the polls that we would see, results in an electoral map that is similar to the one that we've been talking about in relation to President Biden's pathway to victory. I made a video yesterday talking about how President Biden could win the National Electoral College but lose the popular vote across this country. It would be a huge shift and a huge change from what we have seen in years past, in elections past, like Hillary Clinton's, like Al Gore's, where the losing candidate for president ultimately ended up winning more votes nationwide. But in this situation, a 2.5% shift would in fact give President Biden the win in the national popular vote, but also a win in the Electoral College. But it's interesting because the shift in 2022, when we look back at years past and we look at the elections that were similar to the ones that we are analyzing now, midterm elections, but still an election that certainly is important and one that gives us a general indicator about where this country is going, the shift didn't exactly happen on the national front. The polls were actually right when it came down to head-to-head polls against Democrats versus Republicans in the generic ballot. They showed Republicans winning by 2.5. They won by 2.8. But when you actually look at some of the interesting statewide polls, races related to Pennsylvania Senate, Arizona governor, Wisconsin governor, all across this country, there were polls that significantly underestimated the support that Democrats were going to receive in the 2022 midterm elections. And yet the national saw no such change. And the reason for that, I think, largely is because what we saw in terms of the national shift was that voters in some of these battleground states weren't the ones driving the shift. We talked about it yesterday about how Democrats actually lost support in states like New York and California, and Republicans made massive gains in states like Texas and Florida that were driving factors in resulting Republicans winning both the contested and uncontested national popular vote. The difference there is that the national popular vote that you see here, where Democrats lost by 2.8%, captures in all the races where there were no Republican and no Democratic opponents. So in some districts, nearly 100% of the vote was going to one side of the aisle, even if the constituents there didn't necessarily agree with those parties 100% of the time. And so what you found was that there was a difference, slight one, but a difference in generic congressional vote between the contested races and the uncontested races, but ultimately Republicans won both. And for Republicans to have won both and it not translate to victories in Pennsylvania in the Senate race, or Georgia in the Senate race, or Arizona or Nevada or New Hampshire in states that they expected large victories, tells us everything we need to know that these swing states, more often than not, are wrong in terms of polls. And sometimes they underestimate Democrats just as they did in 2022. And so this is a map here, a shift of just 2.5%, which I think is so exceptionally fascinating. Because when you take a look at some of these swing state polls, for instance, the most recent ones in Pennsylvania, a few of them have shown President Biden ahead, but the more recent ones have shown President Trump ahead. But the margin of error in some cases, like the most recent Fox News poll, the most recent one that we've seen, 49 to 47, Donald Trump being ahead by 2 points, is a lead that's within the margin of error. This poll accounts for a possibility that President Biden might be able to win in that circumstance. When we take a look at the Bloomberg Morning Consult poll, this race was similar to a tie. In fact, 4 years ago today, Biden and Trump were tied in this state. Clinton was ahead by 10 points 8 years ago today. So Wisconsin has certainly gone back and forth between being a state that has put Trump ahead, put Biden ahead, put Clinton ahead, put Trump ahead, whatever it might be. But in the most recent poll you see here, that Trump is ahead by 4, and the margin of error is 4. The Hill and Emerson College showed Trump ahead by 3. The margin of error here is 3. Fox News has them tied. The margin of error is 3. And Marquette University has a tie as well, a margin of error of 4. And then we move over to the state of Michigan, where there's a little bit less security here, but the overall average in terms of the margin of error here is nearly perfect for what it matches in terms of the Trump lead by 3.5%. And so what you find is that in this 2.5% shift, Democrats end up winning the Electoral College 270 to 268. And this is the map that I think is the likeliest that we see a Biden victory based on where we are today. Taking a look at these national polls, the numbers, no matter how you cut it, are not looking strong for President Biden across a bunch of battleground states. States like Georgia, which should be significantly less Republican than it is in current polling. States like North Carolina, which arguably should be a lot closer than a 7-point advantage for President Trump. When we take a look at these polls and we take a look at this electoral map, we are working with numbers here that ultimately do show Trump with the upper hand. But the question is, how much validity do we put in polls that just 2 years ago, in fact, less than 2 years ago, severely underestimated Democrats when it came down to these states, but was nearly spot on when it came down to the popular vote? That is why this is such a hard race to bet on, such a hard race to analyze, because the standard wisdom here, the conventional wisdom that we had understood and moved forward with election after election after election, was that Democrats were the ones being overestimated. That Trump and his party, the Republican Party, had seen significant underestimations when it came down to swing state polls, national polls, primary polls, whatever it might be. The Republicans were the ones that in 2016 and in 2020 were underestimated. But the difference between 2016, 2018, and 2020 is that in 2022, the Dobbs v. Jackson decision was given and struck down. Roe v. Wade was overturned. And voters across this country, despite not making abortion the center focus of their issues, when it looked at exit polls, when we looked at preliminary election data, what we found there was, in fact, that voters seemingly did not care as much about abortion as they did the economy, or healthcare, or the border, or immigration. These are things that in polling data from CNN, Fox News, ABC, reputable exit polling sources, these issues, abortion was sometimes in the top 3, but not always. But when the voters actually got there, and when they got to the ballot box, Democrats did significantly better than you could have ever thought. And that's why it was such a shocking election, because the national numbers had said Republicans were up by 2.8. Republicans were up by 4 points. The most recent poll that we saw, only 2 polls out of over 10 in the final stretch of the campaign season, said that Democrats were going to win the national vote. They were wrong. But what they were right about was that Democrats, in fact, had a performance that is similar to Democrats winning the national popular vote by 5. When Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election by winning in a state like Pennsylvania by 1.2%, nobody would have expected that he lost the national popular vote. But after 2022, that is well within the realm of possibility, because Democrats not only won the state of Pennsylvania despite losing the national vote, they, in fact, expanded on President Biden's margin of victory in this state. And that's exactly why the polling data, even if you shift it by 2.5%, gives Democrats a victory with 270 electoral votes. A victory that can happen with the polls being wrong within the margin of error. This same and consistent margin of error that we have seen for these polls in election after election. And the fact is, they went outside the margin of error in terms of how wrong they were in underestimating Democrats back in 2022. I wish I had the perfect numbers here and the polling map from 2022, because it tells us a very interesting story. It shows us exactly how these states were wrong, how these predictive models were wrong when it came down to polls, how Real Clear Politics and their own estimations were wrong. The good news is we spent months staring at the polls in 2022 and weeks after the election analyzing the 2022 elections, that we generally have an idea of what these leads were. For instance, in the governor's race in Arizona, Kari Lake led by 3.4. In the Pennsylvania Senate race, Dr. Oz led by 0.4. In the Wisconsin governor's race, the Republicans led there by less than a point. In a state like Georgia, Herschel Walker was up by roughly 2. In a state like Nevada, Adam Laxalt was up by roughly 4. And in a state like New Hampshire, Democrats were up by less than a point. And so you know what happened here? Also, too, in Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer was up by just a singular point. You know, what happened here across these states was that Democrats significantly outperformed what the polls were saying. For instance, in Wisconsin, Tim Michels, the Republican, was supposed to win by less than 1. He lost by roughly 4. That's a swing of around 4 points. In the state of Arizona, Kari Lake lost by a point. That's a swing here of roughly 4 points. In the state of Nevada, Adam Laxalt was supposed to win by 4, by 3, or 4. He lost by 1. That's a swing at the minimum of 4 points. In Pennsylvania, you saw Dr. Oz was supposed to win by less than half a point. He ended up losing by roughly 5. That's a point of around 5.5. A swing of around 5.5. In Georgia, Herschel Walker was supposed to win by 1 to 2. He lost by 2. That's a swing of 4 points. In the state of New Hampshire, the Republicans were supposed to lose this race by just a point. It was a heavy indicator that the tides were turning against Democrats nationally. They lost by 10. In Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer was supposed to win by 1. She won by 11. And all across the country, the shift at the bare minimum was more than 2.5% in these swing states. In these battleground states that you saw countless polls in the final stretch of the campaign season, hundreds of polls throughout the entirety of the campaign season, millions of dollars spent on gauging and fielding these races for them to be severely underestimating Democratic performance. Why might that be? Because in 2022, Democrats very clearly had an enthusiasm problem. But the one thing that I think was more important than voters turning out against President Biden was voters turning out in favor of reproductive rights. This country is pro-choice. This country aligns with the Democratic Party on the issue of abortion, and that's something Republicans couldn't escape in 2022. And now, Democrats are bringing it back front and center in 2024. What I think we might see, interestingly enough too, is that there might be a retirement coming from the United States Supreme Court. There might be a retirement amongst the Democratic justices, the liberal justices here. And we might find that President Biden may make abortion again a nationalized issue, both by politicizing a Supreme Court retirement, just as Republicans did with Antonin Scalia back in 2015, just as Republicans did with Amy Coney Barrett back in 2020, just as we have seen parties do time and time again. Because the one thing that cannot be undone is Roe v. Wade as of right now. The current composition of the United States Supreme Court would not be willing to overturn the Dobbs v. Jackson decision that struck down the landmark case that was Roe versus Wade. What we will find in 2024 is that there could be, and because there was, I think it's probable, that we see some significant polling errors that end up benefiting Democrats at the end of the day. Because while there may have been that silent Trump vote in 2016, and a less but still silent Trump vote in 2020, this is his third time going around for the presidency, and we saw that there were, in fact, silent Democratic voters in 2022. What could translate very well to being silent Biden voters in 2024. This election cycle is one that is unlike we have seen ever before. The first rematch presidential election since 1956. And looking at it here, the numbers don't have to be too far off for a Joe Biden victory. For all this rhetoric and all this discussion that Biden is doomed to lose, the Democrats need a replacement nominee. All they need is to do a little bit better than they did in 2020 and honestly underperform their shifts in these battleground states from 2022. So if I leave you with anything, it is that the Democratic Party is actually in a better position than I think we have seen popularized across the mainstream media. Of course, President Biden today is losing. The numbers are not in his favor, and in all of the battleground states that matter, he is losing to President Trump. But these leads for President Trump aren't insurmountable. They certainly aren't at a point that you cannot find Democrats the ability to overcome it this coming November. Democrats have done it before. They did it in 2022, and they can do it again. This landscape is different. Abortion matters in ways that it has never mattered in the past presidential elections dating all the way back to 1972. 1972 was when Roe versus Wade was put into law, precedent set by the U.S. Supreme Court that was overturned in 2022. Nearly 50 years later, and 50 years of presidential elections where abortion was practically a non-issue. This time, it matters. And that's exactly why many people out there are much more, hopeful for on the side of President Biden than you otherwise might think. Because if these numbers were applicable in 2016 or in 2020, it would be wraps. People would have no hope for the Democratic Party. But there's a reason that they do. And past election cycles tell you exactly why there should be hope on the Democratic side, because our performances aren't as uncommon as we might think. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.